Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about production changes from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, and this is part 2, so stay with me. So before the holidays, I started part 1, and then I got a little bit distracted with Christmas and New Year's, but I'm ready to do part 2. In part 1, if you want to go back and watch it, I talked about production changes in the 1911 Colt, but then I did some German pistols, including the P38, the Sauer 38H, the HSC, as well as other guns, but I didn't get through them all, so let's do part 2. I'm going to start this video with the Walther PP and PPK. Okay, here's two incredible guns. This is the beginning, 1929, first production of the Walther PP. A very successful design, as you probably know. And this is the very end of production for World War II. It ended in 1945. This is April of 1945. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences. There's actually a lot of minor differences, but nothing that would be that noticeable other than the finish. You do see the high polish finish versus a dull military finish. The other thing that you notice right away is this has the standard logo for the Walther banner and the logo on the left side. And here, they didn't even bother putting it on. Again, 1945, they're losing the war. The Russians are at the gates of Berlin, and the Americans are at the gates of Zelemelis. But let's take, I shouldn't start with the late one. Let's start with the early one. You do see the 90-degree safety, and it's also a fat safety, meaning this goes 90 degrees. And one of the reasons they changed it is when the grips would warp, especially in the PPK, when the grips would warp a little bit and they went down, it hits, and that will chip. So they did a 60-degree safety, you can see here, 60-degree safety, so that helped with that hitting the grip. This grip is loose, by the way, which is also a late war feature, and I'll say more about the grip. But going back to this, you can see the barrel is slightly extended at the end. Here it's a little more flush. This is a Waffen-proof gun, which means it went to the military in 1945. Notice that the trigger looks like it's almost unfinished, very light finish. This almost looks unfinished, the safety. Magazine, by the way, they did have late war, they had some phosphated parts and a W, meaning unhardened. That's important because it means they didn't even bother to harden the metal. So W means unhardened, and it is a phosphated finish. They also used up, I'm convinced that all these late war guns had cracks. These are weighted grips, and they have cracks on the edges here. This one is actually not too bad. This has just a minor crack. They took flawed grips from the early part of production. Probably because they were flawed, they threw them in a bin. At the end of the war, they were using up these cracked grips. It's just minor. I've seen big cracks in there, and I don't switch those out. I recommend you not, because I'm sure it left the factory looking just like that. They also had the wooden grips at the end, and here's a picture of late war 1945 with the wooden grips. Wooden grips are desirable because they're fairly scarce. These are both 7.65, and 90% of the production was 32 caliber or 7.65. Also, you see the magazine. This has a slab side, and it's a high polish Walther banner only, as opposed to the phosphated magazine, and it does have the Walther banner, but also the caliber underneath it. I already talked about the W. I mentioned the slab side, but basically it's just a plastic finger extension, which made it a little easier to pull out. But by the end of the war, they didn't bother with those things. Nobody needed a rest for their pinky finger. And they were, again, the goal is to cut cost and increase production as quickly as they could. You do see some milling marks, and the metal was not fine-tuned or polished. You can see it a lot on the grip straps, where this is a nice high polish, but also the metal was polished. And quickly turn to the other side, you see the same thing on the other side. Other than that, there's not a lot of changes. It didn't deteriorate a whole lot. And the PPK, it deteriorated even less. because they stopped production in 1944. They couldn't keep up with the demand. And the military, if they were asked, I don't know that they did a survey, but generally, I know from production numbers, but also from the orders from the military preferred the PP over the PPK. And many of the police, other than like the Gestapo and plainclothesmen, they all preferred the PP. It was a little sturdier and it also held an extra round. They preferred that over the PPK. So in 1944, they made the decision to cease production of the PPK, which is why at the end, this is 1944, end of production, they still have the logo. Whereas the PP in 1945, they didn't bother with the logo. So this is a very late war gun. Notice the machining, see here? This is actually a police gun, Police Eagle F. It's a Doral frame. They experimented, even though the war was coming to a close, they still experimented with aluminum frames and things like that. You can see the machining marks very pronounced here. And by the way, they went from a brown grip to a black grip. They actually did a transition from this kind of a brown, which is a light mottled brown. Then they did what I call a chocolate brown, which went to gray and finally went to the black grip. Once again, we see a flat bottom magazine. They didn't care about your pinky finger anymore. They did add the caliber once the war started, they added the caliber because they didn't want to confuse the caliber because they did make some 9mm. You do notice that this is a 90-degree safety. This is a 60-degree safety, just like the PP. You see a fire blue safety and a non-fire blue, whereas over here you see almost no finish. That's 45, this is 44. This is actually about 1930. There's other production differences, but I don't want to go into too much detail. You can watch some of my other videos, but you can see how beautiful that finish is, the high polish finish versus the late war dull finish. Now, after I did part 1, somebody actually wrote in the comments, could you show us the differences in production of the FN Browning high power? FN is National Fabrique, National Fabrique, FN Browning. And this is the production changes from the beginning of the war to the end. So what you'll notice, early production, the first 1 or 2,000, they still had the slotted frame for the stock lug right here. Probably Randy can find one, but those were the earliest ones because the Belgians used that, whereas the Third Reich, when the Nazis took over production in the Belgian factory, they said, we don't need that anymore. They did have a tangent sight, which is just an adjustable sight for meters. And they also used a nicer, it's not really a real high polish finish, but it's a nice finish. It has the Waffen Eagles on it, so you know it was during the Nazi era. And then later, not only did they not slot it anymore, but they went to just a fixed sight. Now, if you look at the top, you can see that the front sight is slightly different, and the rear sight is very different. Other than that, there's not a lot of production changes. Just like the HSC, I mentioned they went from wood to plastic at the end. By the way, this is one of the last ones made because it has a B suffix. B suffix was one of the last ones. It's all matching. B suffix has a plastic grip. And I mentioned in the earlier video that it's interesting that like Walther went from plastic to wood. The HSC went from wood to plastic. And then finally, these also went from wood to plastic. Now, there's not a lot of deterioration in the workmanship, and that's because Belgium was liberated really before the very end of the war when things got a lot worse very quickly. But these are two very nice Browning high powers. Well, let's move on to the Russians, one of our allies. It's hard to think of Russia as an ally, but sure enough, they were our ally in World War II. Also, we did send them a lot of 1911 Colts. They had several contracts to get 1911 Colts from us. But like most nations, before World War II, most of the modern armies were using a revolver. And this is an example, most of you have seen the Russian Nagant. It's a very, very good working pistol. I should say it works very well. You can see it's dated 1940, and a lot of these came into the United States after the fall of the Iron Curtain, just because the U.S. was buying weapons from all over. Collectors like myself, you could get on Shotgun News and buy a Nagant for $99.95. And so most of those came in, and they're all they were reworked, and most of them are import stamped. This one does not have the import stamps, and therefore it is a little harder to find, which just means maybe a vet brought it back and traded with a Russian soldier. That there is documentation that they just traded weapons, and he took your 1911 and you brought home their Nagant. Not a fair trade in my opinion, but this is what was early. But then of course the Russians wanted to catch up with the rest of the world, so they needed to develop their own semi-automatic pistol, and that's what they did with the Tokarev. Now this also is dated 1940. You will find a serial number here on the frame, also on the top, and dated 1940. And then finally you'll find a serial number on the bottom of the magazine. A full rig will have a holster, 2 matching magazines, and then matching slide and frame. It functions a lot like most of the semi-automatics, somewhat loosely designed off of the 1911, except the takedown is much different. You take this, I'll call it a clip, you take that off, and then that's the beginning of the process of taking apart the Tokarev. Now, they also deteriorated. This is a high polished finish. Later in the war, you'll see a dull finish with wooden grips, just like the Germans. They went to a dull finish with wooden grips, and here's an example of one from 1944. Okay, now I'm going to pick on the Japanese a little bit. No offense intended to the Japanese. They certainly make quality products today, but they were never really known for their quality weapons. As a matter of fact, a lot of the German officers chose to buy their own weapons. A lot of FNs, Browning FNs, were purchased by the Japanese, as well as other semi-automatic pistols preferred. And there's a number of reasons for that. I won't go into all of the details, but this is a very early one. You can always tell the dates. You just add 25, so this is 1937. 10 is October of 1937. You can see it does have a nickeled magazine. It has the black plastic, could call it a Black Widow. It has the black plastic grip. They did use a nickeled magazine, and actually the German Luger, they started off with a nickeled magazine and then they went to a blued, and so did, this is, by the way, a Nambu Type 94. And they used nickel that has a matching magazine, and I already gave you the date. But I want to say a little bit more about this pistol. They did, just in terms of the quality of the workmanship, I find both this and the Type 14 to be awkward in terms of, especially with the Type 14, a lot of times when you cock it, I have a really hard time getting the magazine out. I think this one works pretty well, and it slams forward, and then it's cocked and ready to go. But here's the problem with it. You put it in your holster, and your holster has this, see this little button here? You put it in the holster, it has a little button. Watch what happens when you push it in. That's right. It just fired by itself. Let's do that again. Can you believe it? They called it the suicide gun. Not Americans. The Japanese officers said it was a suicide gun. You slip it in there, and then all you do is brush up against that button, and there it goes. That basically fires the firing pin. The extractor is just, well, the design is poor, and they knew about it from the beginning of the war, so this is fairly, it's not one of the earliest ones, but this is fairly early, nice high polished finish. But I wanted to show you this end of the war one. By the way, this holster is very rare, canvas holstered. Most of them are leather holsters, clamshell holsters that look like this. This one is a late war. You can see actually this is October of 1944. You add 25. This is October of 37. This is October of 44. They knew the design was problematic, but they didn't change anything about it. In fact, in terms of the quality of the machining and everything is actually far worse. So just like all of the armies of the world, it went from a high polished finish with a nickeled magazine, and notice the wooden grips, they're very plain. This is even chipped. I'm sure it came out of the factory chipped. The magazine is no longer nickeled, but it is blued. Now that is one matching magazine, and I'm going to show you two matching magazines. This gun has actually been on the site for a while, which surprises me because it's a late war, good example of a late war, with this rare canvas holster, with the cleaning rod. That's the cleaning rod that came with it, and two matching magazines. So you can see right here, 081. Two matching magazines, and notice the little dot above. That's an indication of the spare magazine. So this is a complete rig from 1944, very crude, wooden grips, what I think of as a kind of a dangerous gun. And people who shoot them, I've never shot a Nambu. People that shoot them are very brave, but they say they shoot just fine. I'll take their word for it. Okay, the Nambus, by the way, are all 8mm, and the Type 14, they actually made that before the Type 94. The Type 94 was actually meant for pilots and tankers, people who wanted a slightly smaller gun, including officers. But as I said, some officers preferred either the baby Nambu, which was, in my opinion, a much better quality weapon, but and also foreign guns, such as German guns. They did buy German guns and the Browning FN pistols. I believe the models were like the 1910. And so right away we can see these two are early. They have the ridges or stripes in the grip. And I put two of them out here because I actually have a customer who wants to buy a couple of these. So I'll kill two birds with one stone and they can take a look at it. This one is 5.3, which is March of 1930. So that's really early. Notice the high polish finish. Also the cocking knob is going to be a little different. I'll show you that in a minute. Straw small parts. And then this smaller trigger guard. That's the way they were. These early ones came with the small trigger guards. And then about, once the war got started, they were actually invaded China first up in Manchuria. It was actually cold. And their heavy winter gloves would not fit. Or at least it was a little bit harder to get it in there. So then they made the larger. That was one of the production differences. But also, if you look at the grip, that looks like, remember the later Type 94, similar grip. By the way, these are numbered inside, both the Type 94 and these. The early ones, they'll be machine stamped. Later ones, often it's just a pencil mark where they write in the last 3 digits of the serial number. Notice straw small parts over here, but over here they're just blued. You can see the finish has deteriorated. Most often you see that on the front strap. This one has a little bit of corrosion, but this one is a little bit better. This one is a remarkable, beautiful gun, but if my memory serves me right, this one does not have a matching mag, and this one does. I'll show you in a minute. Now this one is somewhat later. This one I already mentioned is 1930. Over here, you see June of 1935. Now, let's test out the magazine. Should end in 644. Nickeled magazine, remember what I said about that, a little better quality workmanship. And 644. And this one was the one that had a little more corrosion to it. And the straw is not as nice. So this has a matching magazine, so that's a plus. By the way, these all come in 8mm. Both types come in 8mm. This one, the straw is a little nicer. Grip straps are beautiful. Just to, again, compare the grip straps. This one's a little duller, and then this is the late war one. You see the machining and a lot duller. But let's check the magazine. And so as my memory says, it's only off by one number. This is 390 and this is 690. Maybe it's a factory error, could easily be. But 390 versus 690, and these magazines work pretty well. Now I mentioned that sometimes you take the cocking knob. Notice the cocking knob changed. Here it's more of a checkered. This is kind of a ribbed. I often have a difficult time. I pull that back and then it's really hard to pull this down. I've had some like this one. This is like a brand new gun. This is the nicest of the three. I can't get it down. That's the opposite of what people usually say. I can't get it down. So The only way, and by the way, maybe some oil would help. I have to be very careful, and I just pry that a little bit. That worked. I know some of you are really upset that I did that, but I seriously could not get it uncocked. And now it's ready to fire. The firing pins are very weak, by the way. They easily break. I mentioned in earlier videos that probably 30–40% of the Nambus that I check, the firing pin is broken on the end. And so here's the late war one. Again, no straw part, the grip is different, the cocking knob is different. Everything else is about the same. I notice on the frame they've added this spring and then also this button. I'm not sure what that does. Excuse me for not researching it enough, but somebody will comment and let me know. I'm not sure what that does. But let's cock this one and see if it's any better. Okay, comes back just fine. Yeah, that one, that is tolerable. It's very difficult, but it is tolerable. Now, this one I also did not check. I'm going to cock it and try it. So if you ever buy a Nambu, this one actually works really easily. So I'm sure you can take it to a gunsmith and they can tighten it up or file something down. This one works really easily, but if you're buying one at a gun show or thinking about buying one, two things you want to check. Even if you buy one from Legacy, just ask us, how easy is it to pull the magazine out? That would be number one. And can you check the firing pin to make sure it's not broken? And is it matching? A lot of times they'll be blank. Later war, blank is fine. Mismatched is not. Or at least if it's mismatched, we need to disclose it. Because they broke so easily, especially the ones that are worn, we'll find that the serial number on the firing pin does not match. So you want to check for those two things. Okay, that was part 2 of the beginning and the end. That's all the pistols I'm going to cover. But in part 3, I'm going to show you some of the differences in the rifles from the beginning to the end. What were some of the changes in production? And be prepared to be surprised.